The wind out here doesn't just howl, it screams. It sounds like a dying animal trapped under the ice. I had to push my shoulder against the steel wheel of the airlock for 10 minutes before the rust finally gave way. My breath is freezing against the collar of my jacket, turning into sharp little crystals of ice that dig into my neck. I need to be quiet. I need to be absolutely silent. But the sound of the heavy steel door groaning shut behind me echoed down the concrete throat of this place like a gunshot. Now, there's only the hum of my own blood in my ears and the rhythmic, terrifying clicking of the Geiger counter clipped to my belt. It's hovering just above baseline, but it's rising. I click on my flashlight. The beam cuts through the stale air, illuminating dust motes that have been floating here since the Cold War. But underneath the smell of rust and old grease, there's something else. Something sweet. Something copper-like. It smells like ozone and fresh blood. I check my rifle check. 1 in the chamber. Safety off. The suppressor adds weight to the front, but I can't risk a loud report in a confined space. Not until I know I'm alone. But I know I'm not alone. I can hear them. Deep in the belly of the facility. The shuffling. It's the sound of soft-soled boots dragging across linoleum. It's the sound of wet, ragged breathing. I adjust the strap of my tactical vest, feeling the reassuring pressure of the ceramic plates against my chest. I move forward, my boots crunching on broken glass. The sign on the wall is in Cyrillic, faded red paint peeling away from the concrete. Biological Research Division 4. Restricted access. The air gets colder the deeper I go. My flashlight sweeps left, then right. A reception desk overturned. Papers scattered like dead leaves. I crouch down, picking up a clipboard. The date on the log is from 3 weeks ago. This place wasn't abandoned in the 90s. It was active until last month. I drop the clipboard. It clatters loudly. I freeze. The shuffling sound stops. Then, a low, guttural growl vibrates through the floorboards. It's coming from the corridor to my left. I raise the rifle, looking down the holographic sight. The red dot hovers in the darkness. I take a slow breath, trying to slow my heart rate. Click. My radio crackles. Static. Then a voice, barely a whisper, cuts through the interference. Get out. If you can hear this, seal the door. The voice cuts off. I'm not turning back. I didn't come all the way to the edge of the world to turn back now. I press forward, hugging the wall. The corridor opens up into a massive atrium. Emergency lights flicker with a sickly green hue. And there they are. Shadows moving in the periphery. Not people. Not anymore. I see a lab coat, white stained crimson. The figure is standing facing the corner, twitching. I take a step. My boot hits a spent shell casing. It skitters across the floor. The figure stops twitching. It slowly turns around. The face is gone. Just raw muscle and teeth. It shrieks, a sound that tears through the silence. I squeeze the trigger. Thwip. Thwip. 2 rounds to the chest. It stumbles but doesn't fall. The 3rd round goes through the eye socket. It drops. But the shriek has woken the others. I hear doors bursting open all around me. The clicking of my gear seems deafening now as I sprint toward the nearest stairwell. I can hear them behind me, a tide of footsteps, a chorus of hunger. I slam through the stairwell door and jam the crowbar through the handles. Bodies slam against the metal from the other side. The door buckles but holds. I'm trapped. I'm inside. And there are 6 levels below me. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door was the loudest sound I had heard in 3 months. It cut through the eternal, howling gale of the Siberian tundra like a scream, signaling that the hermetic seal of the object labeled Site-44B was finally broken. I stood there for a long minute, my breath freezing instantly against the interior of my visor, waiting for the rush of stale air. It hit me a moment later, a cocktail of preserved industrial lubricants, ozone, and that distinctive copper tang of dried blood that never really leaves a place once a massacre has occurred. I checked the Geiger counter strapped to my wrist. Green. Safe from radiation, but the biothreat indicator was blinking a rhythmic amber warning. I clicked the safety off my customized Saiga 12 and stepped out of the white blinding snow into the swallowing dark of the concrete throat. My headlamp cut a cone through the dusty air. This wasn't just a military outpost. The architecture screamed black budget research. The walls were lined with conduit pipes thicker than my thigh, throbbing with a phantom power that shouldn't exist in a facility abandoned since the initial outbreak. Scavenging here required a different mindset. In the cities, you look for food and water. In a place like this, you look for the things that kill the things that kill you. I moved toward the security checkpoint, stepping over a corpse that had been mummified by the dry, cold air of the intake vent. He was wearing a uniform I didn't recognize, black polymer weave, no insignia. I knelt, my gloves creaking in the silence, and patted him down. No weapon, but his belt pouches were a goldmine. 3 magazines of 9 by 39 mm subsonic rounds, armor-piercing gold. A ruggedized PDA with a shattered screen, and a keycard glowing with a faint, dying phosphorescence. I pocketed everything. The rule of the wasteland, take it all, sort it later. The deeper I went, the more the environment felt wrong. The temperature was rising. Outside it was 40 below. Here, it hovered around freezing, warm enough for liquid water to drip from ruptured ceiling pipes. I reached the central atrium, a massive hexagonal hub with corridors branching off like arteries. It was here I saw the first sign of the evolution. The infection hadn't just killed the staff. It had repurposed the building. A thick, fibrous webbing, the color of bruised flesh, coated the electrical junctions. It wasn't mold. It was vascular. I traced the growth with the beam of my light. It pulsated, very slowly, in time with the hum of the facility's backup generators. The infection was leaching power. It was feeding on the electricity to keep the biomass warm. This was new. The shamblers back in Moscow were just animated meat, rotting until they fell apart. This was symbiotic adaptation. I moved toward the sector marked cryogenetics. The door was jammed, fused shut by the fleshy webbing. I used a crowbar, wrenching the metal aside with a groan of steel that echoed terrifyingly down the hall. I paused, listening. Silence returned, but it felt heavier now, expectant. I slipped through the gap. The lab beyond was a graveyard of ambition. Glass cylinders lined the walls, most shattered, the fluids long drained. But the scavenging potential was astronomical. On a stainless steel table, I found a pristine medkit, rapid clot injectors, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and miraculously, a sealed vial of experimental adrenaline. I swept it all into my rucksack. Then I saw the microscope logs on a nearby terminal that was still flickering with life. I wiped the dust off the screen. The last entry was dated 3 years after the fall. Someone had been alive here recently. The text was fragmented. Subject 88. Cold fusion integration. The viral strain is rewriting the carbon lattice of the bone. Armor. I didn't finish reading. A sound from the back of the room froze me. It was the click of a claw on tile. Distinct. Heavy. I killed my headlamp instantly, plunging the room into the red emergency lighting that bathed everything in the color of blood. I crouched behind a centrifuge, clutching the shotgun. The creature that emerged from the shadows of the ventilation shaft was a nightmare of evolution. It wasn't human anymore, not really. It stood on 2 legs, but its posture was hunched, the spine elongated and protruding through the skin in jagged, crystalline spikes. The skin itself was translucent and pale, slick with a secretion that looked like antifreeze. But the worst part was the plating. Where a normal zombie would have rotting flesh, this thing had developed chitinous armor plates over its chest and skull. The rewritten carbon lattice. It was bulletproof biological evolution designed for the tundra. It sniffed the air, not breathing, but filtering. It couldn't see me. Its eyes were covered by the bone growth, but it could sense heat. I realized with a jolt that my body heat was a beacon in this refrigerated hell. I had to move. I spotted a liquid nitrogen tank near the door, the valve rusted but intact. The creature let out a low, chittering rattle and snapped its head in my direction. It knew. I rolled out from cover just as it lunged. The speed was impossible. It crossed 30 feet in a second, its claws gouging deep furrows into the steel centrifuge where I had been a heartbeat before. I didn't aim for the creature. I aimed for the tank. The 12-gauge slug hit the valve of the nitrogen tank with a deafening clang. A plume of white vapor exploded outward, instantly dropping the temperature in the kill zone to absolute 0. The creature shrieked, a sound like grinding metal, as the supercooled gas hit its wet, slick skin. The antifreeze secretion froze. The biological armor cracked. It slowed, its joints seizing up as the thermodynamics turned against it. I didn't wait for it to thaw. I racked the slide and put 2 slugs into the now brittle chest plate. The impact shattered the frozen bone armor like glass, blowing a hole straight through the torso. It collapsed, twitching, the vascular webbing on the floor trying to reach out and reconnect with it, to heal it. I scrambled backward, reloading with trembling hands. I couldn't stay here. If there was one, there were more. I sprinted for the exit of the lab, but I didn't leave empty-handed. I grabbed a hard drive connected to the main server rack on my way out, the research data. If this strain made it to the populated zones in the south, humanity was done. The resistance needed to know that the dead were armoring themselves. The trek back to the surface was a blur of adrenaline and paranoia. The facility seemed to be waking up. The vascular growths on the walls were throbbing faster, turning a deep, angry crimson. I could hear movement in the ceiling tiles, the scuttling of dozens of those things. The heat of the facility was attracting them. I reached the blast door, slamming the manual override. The hydraulics screamed again, agonizingly slow. I squeezed through the opening before it was fully wide, tumbling out into the snow. The wind hit me like a physical blow, but I welcomed it. The cold was safe. The cold slowed them down. I didn't stop running until I reached my snowmobile, hidden under a thermal tarp a mile out. As I keyed the ignition and the engine roared to life, I looked back at the concrete entrance of Site 44B. The heavy steel door was vibrating. Something was pounding on it from the inside, denting the metal. I gunned the engine, the tracks biting into the ice, speeding away into the white void. I touched the hard drive in my pocket. I had the intel, and I had a bag full of high-grade stimulants, but the cost of knowledge was heavy. The infection wasn't just surviving the winter, it was weaponizing it. The wheel of the blast door was colder than death itself, the metal biting through my gloves with a thermal conductivity that felt malicious. I had spent 3 days trekking across the white hell of the Timor Peninsula, following an erratic signal that promised salvation but likely only held ghosts. The concrete maw of the facility, designated Vector North, protruded from the permafrost like the exposed ribcage of a leviathan. As I leaned my entire body weight against the manual override crank, the hydraulics hissed, a sound like a dying breath released after 20 years of holding it. The seal broke. Air, pressurized and smelling of ozone and stale copper, rushed out to meet the Arctic gale. I slipped inside, the heavy steel slamming shut behind me, severing the connection to the whiteout outside. Silence descended instantly. It wasn't the peaceful silence of an empty room. It was the predatory silence of a held breath. My Geiger counter clicked rhythmically, a slow, reassuring heartbeat indicating that radiation wasn't the primary threat here. I clicked on my tactical light, the beam cutting through the suspended dust motes. The lobby was a tomb of bureaucracy. Frozen receptionists sat behind frosted glass, their bodies preserved perfectly by the sub-zero temperatures that had permeated the facility after the power failed. They weren't shamblers. Not yet. One had a pen still poised over a logbook. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching on shattered ceiling tiles. The priority was scavenging. Survival was a math equation, and I was running out of variables. My calorie count was in the red. I needed fats, proteins, and electrolytes. I vaulted the reception desk, ignoring the frozen eyes of the corpse, and rifled through the drawers. Paperclips, a photo of a smiling family in Sochi, and a half-eaten, petrified Snickers bar. I pocketed the candy. Sugar was energy. Energy was life. But the real prize was the security keycard dangling from a lanyard around the receptionist's neck. I cut the cord with my knife, the snap echoing too loudly in the cavernous hall. I moved deeper, past the administrative wing and into the guts of the complex. The air grew colder as I descended, a paradox that suggested the climate control systems down here had malfunctioned in a specific, catastrophic way. I checked my weapon, a battered AK-12 scavenged from a border guard months ago. 12 rounds in the mag, 1 in the chamber. 2 spare magazines. Not enough for a war, but enough for a skirmish. The corridors were lined with heavy piping, dripping frozen condensation. I found a break room on level B2. The vending machines were smashed, looted decades ago, but the pantry in the back was untouched. I pried the door open with a crowbar. Jackpot. Canned peaches, vacuum-sealed rye bread, and tins of military-grade beef stew. I sat on the cold linoleum, shivering uncontrollably as I shoveled cold stew into my mouth. The fat had congealed into a white wax, but to my starving body, it tasted like ambrosia. As I ate, I noticed the scratches on the inside of the pantry door. Deep gouges. Someone had locked themselves in here, not to keep things out, but to keep something in. I shined my light on the floor. A skeleton, picked clean, lay in the corner. But the bones were wrong. They were covered in strange, calcified growths, like coral reef structures blooming from the marrow. I pushed on, driven by the need to understand what Vector North was researching. The labs on level B4 were sealed with biohazard tape that had long since become brittle and flaked away. I swiped the keycard. A red light blinked, then turned green. Emergency power reserves. The door slid open with a grinding screech. The smell hit me first, not rot, but something chemical. Like ammonia and pine. The lab was filled with containment tubes, most of them shattered. Glass crunched under my boots. I moved to a workstation, wiping frost off a terminal screen. It flickered to life. I accessed the logs, skipping to the final entries. Project Cryogenesis. Objective: enhance viral latency in sub-zero environments. I read on, my blood running cold. They weren't trying to cure the infection. They were weaponizing it for the tundra. They wanted super soldiers who could fight in the Russian winter without thermal gear. The virus, designated Siberian strain, didn't just reanimate dead tissue, it reinforced it. It utilized the cold to harden the epidermis, creating a natural armor of necrotic tissue and ice crystals. I heard a sound. A clicking, like ceramic tiles striking together. I killed my light. Darkness swallowed the lab, save for the faint, green luminescence of the emergency exit signs. The sound came again, closer. It wasn't the dragging shuffle of the walkers I was used to. This was sharp, precise. I crouched behind a centrifuge, raising the AK-12. In the dim green light I saw it. It emerged from the shadows of the containment wing. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet, its body elongated. The skin was pale blue, almost translucent, stretched tight over muscles that twitched with unnatural energy. But it was the armor that terrified me. Jagged plates of bone and ice protruded from its shoulders and chest. Its eyes were gone, replaced by crystalline growths. It didn't see, it sensed thermal gradients. And I was the hottest thing in the room. It turned its head, the neck cracking audibly. It let out a shriek that sounded like grinding metal and lunged. I didn't think, I fired. The muzzle flash illuminated the horror in strobing snippets. The bullet sparked off its chest, ricocheting against the bone ice armor. It was bulletproof to small arms fire. I rolled to the left as a clawed hand smashed the centrifuge, sending metal shrapnel flying. I needed a headshot, but the facial structure was reinforced with that same crystalline growth. I scrambled back, my boots slipping on the slick floor. The creature didn't run, it skittered, moving on all fours with terrifying speed. I saw a canister of liquid nitrogen next to a shattered cryopod. A desperate idea formed. I fired at the canister. The round pierced the metal. A jet of supercooled gas erupted, engulfing the creature just as it leaped. It screamed, a human sound distorted by a ruined throat, as the nitrogen froze its joints instantly. The thermal shock was too much for the already cold-adapted biology. The armor cracked. I didn't wait. I sprinted toward the creature, swinging the stock of my rifle with everything I had. I smashed the frozen crystalline growth covering its face. It shattered like glass. I drove the barrel of the gun into the exposed soft tissue beneath and pulled the trigger. The back of its head blew out in a spray of black ichor and ice. It slumped, the light fading from its nervous system. I stood over it, gasping, my breath forming massive clouds in the freezing air. I kicked the corpse. It was heavy, dense. This was the evolution. The virus had learned to wear the winter as a suit of armor. I scavenged the rest of the lab with shaking hands. I found a case of adrenaline injectors and a prototype thermal optic sight. I attached the sight to my rifle immediately. If these things hunted by heat, I needed to see what they saw. I moved to the rear of the lab, finding a heavy bulkhead door labeled deep storage. The wheel was fused with rust, but the electronic lock was active. I hacked the panel, bypassing the safety protocols. The door groaned open. Inside, rows of suspended animation tanks stretched into the darkness. Hundreds of them. And inside each one was a soldier. Not dead. Waiting. The glass on the tanks was frosted, but I could see them twitching. The power fluctuations from my fight had woken the facility's preservation cycle. They were thawing out. I realized then that this wasn't just a research lab. It was a barracks. An army of the dead, armored in ice, waiting for a command that would never come, or perhaps, simply waiting for the temperature to rise. I checked the temperature gauge on the wall. -10 degrees Celsius. It was rising. The fight had damaged the coolant lines. I had to leave. Now. I grabbed a hard drive from the main server. Intel was a currency of its own in the survivor settlements, and turned back toward the exit. The screech of metal on metal echoed from the hall behind me. Another door opening. Then another. The rhythm of clicking steps began to multiply. It sounded like a hailstorm on a tin roof. I ran. I didn't care about stealth anymore. I sprinted through the corridors, the thermal sight on my rifle painting the darkness in shades of blue and orange. Ahead I saw heat signatures blooming like flowers in the dark. 3 of them, blocking the path to the elevator. I checked my Mag-8 rounds. I switched the fire selector to semi-auto. I couldn't spray and pray. I had to surgically dismantle them. I aimed for the joints, the knees, the elbows, the points of articulation where the ice armor was thinnest. I fired. The lead runner dropped, its knee shattered. The second one lunged, and I met it with the butt of the rifle, feeling the impact rattle my teeth. I shoved the barrel under its chin and fired. The third was on me before I could cycle the bolt. Cold claws tore through my jacket, grazing my ribs. The pain was sharp, searing. I screamed and jammed a flare into its face, pulling the tab. Magnesium fire erupted, blindingly white. The creature recoiled, thrashing as the heat burned through its sensory clusters. I kicked it away and scrambled into the elevator shaft, prying the doors open. The car was stuck 3 floors up. I jumped for the cables. The climb up was agony. My gloves were slick with sweat and blood. Below me, the shaft echoed with the shrieks of the waking army. I hauled myself onto the lobby floor, my lungs burning. I limped toward the airlock, the adrenaline crash hitting me like a physical blow. I cranked the wheel, the hydraulics screaming in protest. The blast door opened, and the Arctic wind hit me again. It felt warmer than the air inside. I stumbled out into the snow, the whiteout swallowing me instantly. I looked back at the concrete monolith. The lights in the lobby were flickering. Shadows moved behind the frosted glass. They were awake, and I had just rung the dinner bell. The wind outside was a physical weight, a screaming banshee of ice and snow that had battered my senses for 3 days straight. But the silence inside the facility was worse. It was a heavy, pressurized silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums and demands to be broken. I stood in the airlock of Facility 4 Kilo, the heavy blast door sealed behind me with the grinding protest of rusted hydraulics. My breath plumed in the beam of my tactical light, a dense fog that obscured the hallway ahead. The temperature gauge on my wrist read -20 degrees Celsius inside the complex. Warmer than outside, but deadly enough. The air smelled of stale ozone, copper, and something sweeter, like antifreeze mixed with rot. I adjusted the straps of my rucksack, the nylon stiff with cold. Scavenging wasn't just about grabbing loot. It was an arithmetic of survival. Weight versus utility. Calories versus expenditure. I moved toward the security checkpoint, my boots crunching on shattered safety glass. The booth was a tomb. Inside, a guard sat slumped in a chair, his uniform preserved by the deep freeze. This was the first test. I approached cautiously, my pry bar raised. In the tropics, the dead rotted into sludge within weeks. Here, they were statues. I nudged the corpse. Hard as granite. But then I saw it, the evolution. The virus hadn't just killed him, it had reinforced him. Where the skin had split from frostbite, I didn't see red muscle or white bone. I saw a lattice of black, crystalline structures. The infection in the southern zones turned people into shambling sacks of fluid. Here, the pathogen had adapted to the extreme cold by synthesizing a biological cryoprotectant. It turned their blood into a sludge that refused to freeze solid, and it hardened their tissues into organic armor. I carefully reached for the guard's belt, unclipping a submachine gun, a PP-19 Bison. The action was stiff, coated in frozen cosmoline. I checked the mag full. 9mm armor piercing. A gold mine. I stripped his vest, taking 2 spare magazines and a sealed pouch containing a keycard and a partially frozen energy bar. I ate the bar immediately, shivering as the icy chocolate hit my stomach. Pushing past the checkpoint, I entered the main atrium. Emergency lights flickered on a low-power loop, casting strobing shadows that made the overturned furniture look like crouching beasts. I needed antibiotics and data. The rumors from the resistance radio mentioned that 4 Kilo was working on a cure when the world went dark. Instead, it looked like they had been working on a weapon. I swept the room, checking the corpses of scientists scattered across the floor. They were different from the guard. Some had been torn apart, but the wounds were cauterized, sealed by that same black resin. I found a datapad near a desiccated hand. The battery was dead, but I had a portable charge brick. I plugged it in, waiting for the screen to flicker to life while I kept my weapon trained on the hallway. The screen glowed green. The last entry was audio. I played it, the volume thumbed down to a whisper. Subject 89 is changing, a frantic voice hissed. The cryogenic suspension didn't halt the replication. It accelerated it. The virus is consuming the nitrogen coolant, using it to build a thermoregulation layer. They aren't cold-blooded anymore. They are heat sinks. They absorb warmth. If you get close, they drain you. The recording cut to static. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. Heat sinks. I looked at the thermal scope on my rifle, flipping it on. The hallway was awash of blue and purple cold, but in the distance, near the elevators, there was a void. A patch of space that was colder than the surroundings. Absolute zero blackness against the dark blue. It wasn't empty space. It was a silhouette. I killed the light. Darkness swallowed the atrium. I crouched behind a reception desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. Scavenging required patience. If the audio log was right, that thing down the hall hunted by sensing heat differentials. I was a burning flare in a world of ice. I slowly pulled a thermal blanket from my pack, wrapping it tight around my body, covering my head, leaving only a slit for my eyes. It was suffocating, trapping my body heat, but that was the point. The silhouette moved. It didn't shuffle. The articulation of its joints sounded like cracking ice. Asterisk click. Snap. Click. Asterisk it was fast, jerky movements, unnatural and arachnid. I watched through the gap in the desk as it entered the atrium. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet, its limbs elongated. The skin was pale blue, translucent, revealing the black web of the modified virus beneath. Jagged spikes of bone had erupted from its shoulders and spine. Heat dissipation vents? No sensory organs. It paused by the dead guard I had looted. It placed a hand on the corpse. I watched in horror as the frost on the guard's uniform melted instantly. The creature was absorbing the residual thermal energy, however minute, from the surroundings. It was feeding on the microclimates. It turned its head, a face devoid of eyes, just a row of heat-sensing pits where the nose should be. It screeched, a sound like metal shearing, and vaulted over the security barrier. I needed to move. I needed to get deeper into the lab, away from this hunter. I waited until it skittered toward the mess hall, drawn perhaps by the lingering heat of a failing generator vent. Once it was out of sight, I moved. Silent. Fast. I took the stairs down, bypassing the elevator. Level B2, Research and Containment. The air here was different. Sterile. The smell of rot was replaced by the sharp tang of formaldehyde. I found the supply closet I had hoped for. A hazmat locker. I pried it open, my fingers numb and clumsy. Inside, a jackpot. 3 ampoules of broad-spectrum antibiotics, a sealed trauma kit, and a canister of liquid nitrogen. Why liquid nitrogen? I didn't know, but in this hell, everything was a tool. I shoved them into my pack. Then I saw the containment units. Rows of reinforced glass tubes lining the walls. Most were broken, shattered from the inside out. But one was intact. Inside floated a torso, severed at the waist, wires and tubes hooked into the spine. The monitor next to it was still running on auxiliary power. Strain Delta Frost, the text scrolled. Status dormant. Evolution, kinetic absorption. I stopped reading. Kinetic absorption? That meant bullets wouldn't just be ineffective. They would feed it. The energy of the impact would be converted. I looked at the submachine gun in my hand. Useless against the alphas. I needed fire, or I needed to freeze them until they shattered. A noise behind me. Not the clicking of the ice hunter. This was wet. Slapping. I spun around. From the shadows of the broken containment unit, a mass of flesh pulled itself forward. It wasn't a humanoid zombie. It was a biomass, a fused collection of limbs and organs that had survived the lab's purge. It had no legs, dragging itself with 3 arms. Its face was a rictus of agony, fused with a gas mask. It lunged. I didn't shoot. I swung the pry bar, aiming for the skull. The impact jarred my arm, vibrating through my bones. The creature didn't recoil. It absorbed the blow, the flesh rippling like water, and surged forward faster. It had taken the kinetic energy of my strike and used it to propel itself. I kicked it back, the sole of my boot meeting its chest, and the same thing happened. It bounced back with double the force, throwing me into the metal racking. Pain flared in my back, but adrenaline washed it out. I scrambled up, realizing the rules of engagement had completely shifted. I couldn't hit it. I couldn't shoot it. I grabbed the canister of liquid nitrogen from my pack. It was heavy, awkward. The biomass screamed, a gurgling, wet noise, and coiled to spring. I didn't aim at the creature. I aimed at the floor beneath it. I twisted the valve and kicked the canister forward. A cloud of white vapor exploded into the room, instantly dropping the temperature to absolute freezing levels. The metal floor groaned and contracted. The creature hit the fog and stalled. It wasn't impact. It was just cold. Extreme, sudden cold that bypassed its adaptations. The black sludge in its veins finally crystallized. It slowed, stiffened, and then froze mid-lunge, a grotesque sculpture of ice and meat. I stood there, panting, my breath forming clouds that froze on my face mask. This wasn't just a survival situation anymore. This was a war against biology itself. The infection had learned. It had weaponized physics. I retrieved the canister, half empty now, and looked down the dark corridor of Sector B3. That's where the main server was. That's where the data on the cure would be. But if the things on B2 could absorb kinetic energy, and the things on the ground floor could hunt by heat, what the hell was waiting for me in the basement? I checked my gear. 1 canister of nitrogen. A gun that might be useless. And a backpack full of medicine that wouldn't save me from being torn apart. I took a step forward. The darkness of the tunnel seemed to stretch out, hungry and waiting. I clicked my flashlight back on. The beam shook just a little. I wasn't leaving without that data. I stepped over the frozen biomass, the sound of my boots on the metal grate echoing like a dinner bell. The wind out here doesn't just blow, it scours. It strips the heat from your blood and the hope from your marrow. Standing before the concrete maw of Facility 33, half buried in a drift that had likely accumulated over a decade, I felt the kind of primal dread that usually warns prey to turn back. But turning back meant a slow death by starvation in the wastes, and the heavy, rusted blast door in front of me promised the one thing worth dying for: high-tier salvage. I chipped away the ice sealing the manual override panel with the butt of my pry bar. The metallic clack 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 echoing too loudly in the white silence. With a groan of hydraulic failure and grinding gears, the door gave way, opening just enough for a human silhouette to slip through. I squeezed inside, the abrupt silence of the interior hitting me harder than the cold. The airlock was a tomb. My flashlight beam cut through stagnant dust motes that had hung undisturbed since the fall of civilization. The first thing I noticed wasn't the smell. The cold had frozen the rot, but the posture of the dead. 3 guards in full riot gear sat slumped against the far wall. They hadn't been overrun, they had been executed. Single shots to the temple, sidearms still in their holsters. I approached the nearest corpse, my boots crunching on shatter-resistant glass. Scavenging is a respectful desecration. I knelt, checking the guard's rig. The Kevlar was brittle, useless, but the pouches held gold. 2 magazines of 5.56 millimeters, cold to the touch but uncorroded. A sealed commercial epinephrine injector. A jagged, heavy keycard dangling from a belt clip. I took it all. As I stood, I swept the light over the guard's face. The skin was gray and drawn tight, but it was the veins that paused me. They were black, thick as ropes, and they didn't look like they had collapsed in death. They looked like they had tried to burst out of the skin. I pushed deeper, past the security checkpoint and into the admin sector. The layout was standard military efficiency. Drab gray hallways, flickering emergency lights running on some dying geothermal backup deep below. I raided the offices first. Most survivors skip the paperwork, but paperwork tells you what killed the people before you. In a smashed server room, I found a clipboard partially fused to a desk by a blackened, organic residue. The log was dated 3 weeks after the initial global outbreak. Asterisk. Subject 89 shows hyperadaptive traits. T-virus strain Delta isn't killing the host's motor functions. It's rewiring them. Calcification of the dermis observed. Aggression levels critical. Asterisk. I pocketed the log. Evolution. That was the rumor that brought me here. The idea that in these isolated, high-tech incubators, the infection hadn't just stagnated, it had bloomed. The descent into the research sector required the keycard. The elevator shaft was a gaping throat, the car stuck somewhere on the lower levels. I rappelled down the cables, the friction burning through my gloves even with the heavy leather. Level B3 bioweapons. The air here was different. Warmer. Humid. It smelled of copper and ozone. My Geiger counter gave a lazy click every few seconds, safe, but barely. The corridor ahead was lined with containment cells. The glass on the first 3 was shattered from the inside out. Blood trails, black and tar-like, smeared the floor, leading toward the central lab. I moved silently, weapon raised. The silence was broken by a wet, rhythmic thumping coming from the end of the hall. I sliced the corner, aiming down the sights of my carbine. The central lab was a cavernous space filled with overturned centrifuges and smashed sample tanks. In the center, hunched over a pile of biohazard suits, was something. It was humanoid, but the anatomy was all wrong. The back was hunched, the spine protruding and jagged, bone-white spikes that looked sharpened. Its skin wasn't rotting soft tissue. It was plated, gray and hard like chitin. This was what the log meant. The virus here hadn't just reanimated the dead, it had fortified them. It was eating the biomass of the suits, maybe seeking residual proteins. I stepped on a shard of glass. The sound was microscopic, but the thing's head snapped around with mechanical precision. It didn't have eyes, just smooth, bone-armored sockets and a mouth full of needle teeth that unhinged like a snake. It shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and charged. It didn't shamble. It sprinted low to the ground, using its hands like a primate. I fired. 2 shots to the chest. The rounds sparked off the bone plating, ricocheting into the darkness. Panic flared, hot and bright. I adjusted aim, dropping to a knee. The legs. Shoot the mechanics. I put 3 rounds into its right knee. The joint shattered, spraying black ichor, and the creature tumbled, skidding across the linoleum. It wasn't dead, just mobility killed. It clawed toward me, snapping its jaws. I didn't waste ammo finishing it. I skirted wide, circling around the specimen tables. This was the evolution. Armor plating. Heightened sensory processing. The cold of the tundra had forced the virus to adapt, to harden the hosts against the elements and trauma. If these things got out of the lab, the standard tactics, headshots and melee, would be obsolete. I reached the back of the lab, the cold storage vault. This was the prize. The heavy door was locked, but the glass pane was cracked. I used the butt of the rifle to finish the job, clearing the jagged shards and climbing through. Inside, the temperature plummeted again. Racks of vials lined the walls, bathed in blue UV light. I ignored the samples. I'm a scavenger, not a scientist, and went for the gear lockers. Jackpot. A prototype hazmat suit, sleek and armored, designed for combat in viral zones. A crate of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. and a weapon I'd only seen in schematics, a pneumatic rivet gun modified for tactical use, silent and devastating. I loaded my pack, the weight of the loot a comforting burden. Then the lights died. Total blackout. The low hum of the ventilation cut out, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It wasn't coming from the hallway I entered. It was coming from the ventilation duct above the vault. The evolved variants were pack hunters, and I had just walked into the larder. I clicked my flashlight to high beam, illuminating the vent just as the grate buckled. Long, pale fingers with obsidian claws gripped the metal. I racked the slide on my rifle, the sound deafening in the small room. The scavenger hunt was over. The survival test had begun. I looked at the heavy pneumatic rivet gun in my hands, checked the pressure gauge, and aimed at the ceiling. Time to see if the new toys worked. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door was the loudest sound I had heard in 3 weeks. It cut through the eternal, howling gale of the Siberian exterior. A mechanical sigh that signaled the breaking of a seal that had held for God knows how long. As the 3-foot-thick steel slab ground open, revealing the abyssal maw of Facility 33B, the temperature differential hit me like a physical blow. Outside, it was 40 below, a temperature that turned breath to ice crystals instantly. Inside, it was stale, smelling of ozone, recirculated dust, and the copper tang of old blood, but it was warmer. Maybe 10 below. Tropical, by my current standards. I stepped into the decontamination airlock, my Geiger counter clicking rhythmically, a slow, steady heartbeat that told me the radiation was elevated but survivable. I wasn't here for comfort. I was here for calories and caliber. The heavy parka I wore, scavenged from a dead oil rig worker miles back, was stiff with frozen gore and frost. I stripped the outer layer, keeping the tactical vest and the customized Saiga 12 shotgun close. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a security checkpoint that had been turned into a slaughterhouse. There were 4 bodies. Guards. They hadn't turned. They had been torn apart. This was the first lesson of the tundra, the cold preserves. These men had died months, maybe years ago, but the dry, freezing air had mummified them rather than letting them rot. Their faces were taut, leathery masks of terror. I knelt by the nearest corpse, checking the mag pouches. 2 magazines for a PP-19 Bison. 9mm Makarov. Not compatible with my gear, but I took the rounds anyway. Powder is powder, and lead is lead. If I found a reloading bench, I could melt them down. I checked his pockets. A crumpled pack of cigarettes, frozen solid, and a keycard. Level 3 clearance. Jackpot, I whispered, my voice sounding too loud in the dead acoustics of the concrete tomb. I moved deeper, past the checkpoint and into the labyrinth of the facility. The architecture was brutalist Soviet functionality met with high-tech retrofitting. Cables hung from the ceiling like disemboweled intestines. My objective was the commissary first, lab second. I needed fuel. The map on the wall indicated the mess hall was on sub-level 2. I took the stairs. Elevators were death traps in the apocalypse, coffins waiting for a power failure. Sub-level 2 was flooded. Not with water, but with a frozen black sludge that crunched under my boots. It was chemical runoff mixed with biomatter. I kept my light trained high. In the cafeteria, I found the holy grail of scavenging, unopened crates. Not just local rations, but imported military MREs. The localized panic must have happened so fast they didn't have time to eat. I pried open a crate with my combat knife. Tushanka. Canned beef stew. I cracked a can open right there, not bothering to heat it. The fat was a solid white puck, but to my starving body, it tasted like salvation. I shoveled it in, feeling the energy hit my bloodstream, sharpening my senses. I loaded my pack until the straps dug into my shoulders. 20 cans, water purification tablets, and a box of high-caffeine chocolate bars. With my belly full, the paranoia set in. Why was this here? Why wasn't it looted? The answer lay on the floor near the kitchen's service entrance. A barricade. Tables, chairs, industrial mixers, all piled up against the double doors leading to the storage lockers. Something had tried to get in. Or something had tried to keep something out. I approached the barricade, my shotgun raised. The metal of the door was warped, bulging outward as if something possessing hydraulic strength had punched it from the inside. I bypassed it, heading for the research wing on sub-level 4. This was where the money was. I needed antibiotics, stimulants, anything to keep the frostbite at bay. But as I descended, the environment changed. The walls were no longer gray concrete. They were coated in a translucent, resinous substance. It looked like ice, but it was sticky. I found a terminal in the chief researcher's office that still had juice, running on an emergency backup loop. I wiped the frost from the CRT monitor and accessed the logs. The text was fragmented, corrupted, but the gist was terrifying. They hadn't just been studying the virus here, they were weaponizing its resistance. Subject 89 Delta. The log read. Adaptation to sub-zero environments complete. The pathogen has synthesized a natural antifreeze glycoprotein similar to Arctic cod, but aggressive. It doesn't just stop the host from freezing, it utilizes the cold. The host's metabolism slows to a crawl, entering a hyper-efficient hibernation state. They do not starve. They wait. Heat triggers the predatory response. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Heat triggers them. I looked down at my chest. I had cracked a chemical hand warmer earlier and shoved it into my vest to keep my core temp up. I was a walking heat signature in a tomb of cryostasis. A sound echoed from the corridor outside. It wasn't a groan. The standard Chambliss groaned. This was a chittering sound, like ice cracking under pressure. Click, click, snap. I killed my flashlight instantly, plunging the room into darkness. I unslung the thermal optic monocular I'd scavenged from the airfield and held it to my eye. The world turned blue and black, cold and dead. Then I saw it. Standing in the doorway was a silhouette burning with a dull, cold luminescence. It wasn't warm like a living human. It was colder than the air around it, creating a negative heat signature. The infection had evolved. It had mutated the host's skin into a hardened, crystalline carapace that acted as armor and camouflage. Spikes of bone and frozen fluid protruded from its shoulders. It didn't have eyes, just smooth, pale flesh where sockets should be. It sensed thermal gradients. It turned its head, snapping toward me. It could smell the heat of the hand warmer. I didn't hesitate. I raised the Saiga 12 and squeezed the trigger. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the confined space. The slug hit the creature's center mass. Standard rotters would have exploded, but this thing was dense. The slug shattered the ice armor on its chest, knocking it back, but it didn't drop. It shrieked, a high-pitched, glass-shattering sound that triggered a chorus of answering screeches from the darkness of the hallway. Hive mind, I cursed, racking the bolt. They communicate. I sprinted for the secondary exit, a maintenance hatch leading to the ventilation shafts. The creature lunged, moving with terrifying speed, skittering along the wall like a spider. I fired again, this time aiming for the legs. The heavy buckshot sheared off a limb, sending the thing tumbling into a pile of frozen office supplies. It thrashed, leaking a blue, viscous fluid that smoked when it hit the floor. I dove into the vent, dragging my pack behind me, and kicked the grate shut just as two more of the pale horrors slammed into it. Their claws, elongated and hard as diamonds, raked against the metal, sparking. I scrambled backward through the shaft, the metal biting into my knees. The ventilation system was a maze, but it led upwards. I could hear them swarming below, a cacophony of clicking and shrieking. They were hunting, and for the first time since the outbreak, they were faster than me. I needed to slow them down. I pulled a flare from my vest. Red phosphorus. Burns at over 1,000 degrees. I waited until I heard the scuttling directly behind me in the duct. I popped the cap and tossed the flare back down the shaft. The brilliant red light exploded, blinding in the darkness. The heat was intense. The reaction was instant. The creatures screamed, not in anger, but in agony. The heat didn't just burn them, it disrupted their biology. The logs said they utilized the cold. Intense heat overloaded their systems, causing rapid cellular breakdown. I heard bodies popping like overcooked sausages. I scrambled up the ladder to the surface level, gasping for air. I burst out of a ventilation hood into the snow-blind exterior. The wind was still howling, but now it felt welcoming. The extreme cold was my armor against them, as long as I didn't let them get close. I looked back at the facility. The heavy blast doors were still open. I couldn't leave it like that. If those things got out, if they migrated south, the winter wouldn't kill the zombies anymore. The winter would become their domain. I trudged toward the generator building I'd bypassed earlier. I had C4 in the pack, mining charges from a quarry I'd looted. I wasn't just scavenging anymore. I was closing the lid on Pandora's box. I set the charges on the main coolant lines and the structural supports of the entrance. As I walked away, retreating into the whiteout of the storm, I triggered the detonator. The ground shook. A dull thump resonated through the permafrost, followed by the groan of collapsing concrete. The entrance to Facility 33B imploded, burying the superstrain under 1,000 tons of rock and ice. I adjusted my pack, feeling the weight of the food and the new knowledge. The infection was learning. It was adapting. And if I wanted to survive, I had to stop looking for a safe place to hide. There were no safe places. There was only the hunt. The hydraulic seal of the blast door hissed, a sound like a dying serpent, as the heavy tungsten carbide slab ground open. A cloud of vaporized nitrogen spilled out, swirling around my boots, instantly freezing the moisture on my shin guards. I stepped into the atrium of Facility 33B, the beam of my shoulder-mounted flashlight cutting a harsh white cone through the stagnant subterranean air. The silence here was different from the tundra above. Up there, the wind screamed, a constant reminder of nature's indifference. Down here, the silence was predatory. It was the silence of held breath. I checked the seal on my rebreather. The air scrubbers in the facility had likely failed a decade ago. And God knows what airborne pathogens had been brewing in the dark since the lockdown. My objective was simple: scavenge food, munitions, and medical supplies, then get back to the surface before the sun dipped below the horizon. But as I moved past the reception desk, stepping over the desiccated remains of a security guard whose ribcage had been shattered outward, I realized this place held more than just loot. The guard's P-90 submachine gun lay nearby, half-rusted. I stripped it for parts, pocketing the magazine and the optical sight. Standard scavenging protocol: take what works, leave the dead weight. Moving deeper into Sector 1, the hallway walls were lined with frosted reinforced glass. Behind them were offices, frozen in time. I breached a supply closet with a crowbar, the metal screeching echoing too loudly in the corridor. Inside I hid a jackpot, not food, but batteries. Lithium thionyl-chloride cells, military grade. Enough to power my thermal optics for a month. I swept them into my pack, along with 3 sealed boxes of antiseptic gauze and a bottle of broad-spectrum antibiotics. These were worth more than gold now. Infection killed more survivors than the teeth of the dead did. As I descended to Sublevel 2, the temperature dropped further. My breath fogged the faceplate of my mask. The architecture changed from administrative drab to sterile, clinical white. This was the research wing. Here, the signs of struggle were different. There were no bullet holes, no barricades made of overturned desks. Instead, the heavy containment doors had been clawed at. Deep gouges, 3 inches into the steel, marred the surfaces. Whatever had done this possessed strength far beyond the shambling, rotting corpses I dealt with on the surface. I found an unlocked terminal in Lab 4. The backup generator was barely humming, keeping the core systems on life support. I wiped the dust from the screen and accessed the logs. The timestamps were from 3 years after the initial global outbreak. While the rest of the world was burning, they were still working down here. I scrolled through Dr. Arkov's entries. Day 1402. The strain has mutated in response to the ambient temperature of the containment units. We thought the cold slowed them down. We were wrong. The virus isn't dormant. It's synthesizing a biological antifreeze. The subject's blood viscosity is increasing, turning into a non-Newtonian fluid. They don't freeze. They harden. I swallowed hard, the dryness of my throat scratching against the recycled air. Evolution. The virus wasn't just a brute force animator anymore. It was an intelligent pathogen adapting to its environment. I looked through the observation window into the containment pit below. It was dark, but my thermal optics painted the scene in shades of blue and violet. There were bodies down there. Dozens of them. But they weren't moving. They were huddled together in a massive pile, like a hive of bees protecting the queen. I needed to cross the catwalk above the pit to reach the armory on the far side. I moved low and slow, placing my feet carefully on the metal grating to minimize vibration. I was halfway across when I saw it. The pile shifted. It wasn't a random twitch. The bodies were fusing. The hardening Arkov mentioned wasn't just individual armor. The viral secretion was acting as a binding agent. They were welding themselves together to conserve heat, creating a single, massive organism. I froze. A head snapped up from the pile. It was hairless, the skin pale and translucent, pulled tight over the skull. There were no eyes, just calcified ridges where the sockets used to be. It sniffed the air, the nostrils flaring. It couldn't see me, but it could smell the heat radiating from my suit. The creature, no, the colony, began to rise. It was a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and torsos, moving with a fluid, terrifying coordination. A low, grinding chitter emanated from it, the sound of bone rubbing against bone. I didn't wait to see it fully form. I broke into a sprint. The stealth phase was over. I hit the door to the armory shoulder first, tumbling inside and slamming the lock. A second later, a heavy impact shook the frame. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight sweeping the room. Racks of assault rifles, most stripped, but in the back, a locked cage. I used the crowbar, adrenaline lending me the strength to torque the padlock until it snapped. Inside, a prototype Gauss rifle and cases of ferromagnetic slugs. Silent, high velocity, no muzzle flash. Perfect for the environment. I loaded the weapon, the capacitors whining with a high-pitched charge. The door behind me buckled. The steel groaned, the hinges screaming under the pressure. I scanned the room for another exit. A ventilation duct, high on the wall. I dragged a crate over, climbed up, and kicked the grate in. As I pulled myself into the cramped shaft, the armory door gave way. I looked back. The thing that poured into the room was a nightmare of efficiency. It was a wall of muscle and teeth, a dozen humans fused into a battering ram. The lead host, the eyeless one, opened its jaw, a jaw that unhinged like a snake's, and let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a frequency, a biological signal. Suddenly, the ventilation shaft vibrated. I wasn't alone in the vents. Smaller variants. Runts. The virus had specialized. The large mass broke doors. The smaller ones hunted in the crevices. I crawled backward, firing the Gauss rifle. The slug hit the approaching crawler in the shoulder, shattering the calcified armor and blowing the limb clean off. No blood, just a spray of blue, viscous sludge that froze instantly upon hitting the cold metal. I scrambled through the maze of ducts, checking my wrist comp for the schematic. The incinerator room. If I could get there, I could flush the vents. The scratching behind me grew louder, a frantic scuttling of claws on steel. I dropped out of a vent into the incinerator control room, landing in a crouch. My hand hovered over the fuel purge lever. Through the reinforced glass of the furnace chamber, I saw them spilling out of the vents I had just escaped. They were fast, their limbs elongated, fingers fused into bone hooks. They were built for climbing, for pursuit. The virus had turned them into apex predators of the dark. I yanked the lever. The incinerator roared to life, jets of promethium fuel igniting in a blinding white storm. The shrieks were deafening, a chorus of agony that vibrated through the floor. I watched them burn, their hardened shells cracking and popping like ceramic in a kiln. But even as they burned, they didn't stop trying to reach the glass. They threw themselves at the window, their melting faces sliding down the pane, jaws snapping until the very end. I didn't stay to watch the ash settle. I grabbed a canister of the promethium fuel, highly volatile, extremely valuable, and strapped it to my rig. I made my way to the emergency stairwell, ascending 2 steps at a time, my lungs burning. As I burst out into the surface airlock, the wind hit me again, but this time it felt welcoming. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the tundra. I locked the blast door from the outside and welded the keypad shut with a thermite strip I'd saved for emergencies. It wouldn't hold them forever, not with how they were evolving, but it would buy me time. I looked at the canister of fuel and the high-tech rifle on my back. I had survived, and I had secured weapons that could kill these new horrors. But as I trudged through the snow, back toward my rover, I couldn't shake the image of the hive in the pit. They were adapting to the cold, to the dark, to the hunger. We were scavenging the old world to survive, but they were building a new one. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door ceiling behind me severed the connection to the howling Siberian wind, replacing the shrieking gale with a silence so absolute it felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. The air inside the airlock was stale, recycled a decade ago, tasting of ozone and dead copper. I didn't take off my respirator. In a place like this, a darker shadow on a satellite map, buried beneath 6 feet of permafrost, you assume the air is poison until the sensors tell you otherwise. My Geiger counter clicked rhythmically, a slow, steady heartbeat indicating low-level background radiation, nothing acute. I swept the beam of my tactical light across the decontamination chamber. The tiles were pristine white, untarnished by the grime of the apocalypse that had swallowed the rest of the world. It was a time capsule, preserved by the cold and the secrecy. I moved to the lockers lining the far wall, the instinct of the scavenger taking over. Survival isn't about bravery. It's about calorie-to-weight ratios and ammunition counts. I pried the first locker open with the edge of my combat knife. Inside hung a crisp, white lab coat and a standard-issue PBF gas mask. Useless. I moved to the next. Pay dirt. A security vest, Kevlar weave, lighter than the plate carrier I was sweating in. I swapped them out, the Velcro tearing loud in the quiet. In the bottom of the locker, a box of 9mm rounds, Russian manufacture, steel-cased. I fed them into my empty magazines, the metallic clack-clack-clack a comforting ritual. Every bullet was another minute of life. I checked the expiration dates on the emergency rations tucked on the top shelf. 10 years past due. I took them anyway. Hunger makes you forgive the taste of rancid preservatives. Pushing deeper into the complex. The architecture shifted from sterile entryways to the utilitarian oppression of Soviet-era brutalism mixed with high-tech containment. Cables snaked along the ceiling like exposed guts. I found a directory on the wall, the plastic cracked. Sector 4, Viral Pathogen Research. That was the target. That was where the answers, and the danger, would be. As I descended the stairwell, the temperature dropped. It shouldn't have. Underground bunkers usually stay warmer than the surface, regulated by geothermal loops. But here, the air bit at exposed skin. Frost patterns bloomed on the handrails. I reached the landing of Sector 4 and found the first body. It wasn't a shambler. It was a scientist, dead by his own hand, a Makarov pistol still gripped in frozen fingers. He was slumped against a heavy containment door, a datapad resting on his lap. I knelt, keeping my weapon trained down the hallway, and picked up the pad. The battery was dead, but I had a portable charge brick. It took 3 minutes to boot, 3 minutes of listening to the settling groans of the facility, eyes darting at shadows. When the screen flickered to life, the logs confirmed my worst fears. Subject 87 Delta, the entry read. The Necroborealis strain does not succumb to cryogenic stasis. We assumed the cold would slow metabolic function. We were wrong. The virus synthesizes a biological antifreeze, a glycoprotein that prevents cellular crystallization. In sub-zero temperatures, the host does not hibernate. It hardens. The epidermal layer calcifies. Muscle density increases. They are evolving to hunt in the winter. I swallowed hard, the dry click audible in my throat. I wasn't just dealing with the walking dead. I was dealing with apex predators adapted to the very environment I thought was my shield. I pocketed the datapad. Information was tradable currency if I ever found another settlement. I breached the lab. The room was a chaotic mess of shattered glass and overturned centrifuges. But the supply cabinet, reinforced steel, was locked. I pulled my pry bar, wedging it into the gap. With a groan of straining metal, it popped. Inside was the scavenger's holy grail, broad-spectrum antibiotics, adrenaline injectors, and vials of a blue, viscous liquid labeled experimental inhibitor. I loaded everything into my pack, wrapping the glass vials in gauze to prevent breakage. My pack was getting heavy, shifting my center of gravity. I had to be careful. Then I heard it. Not a moan, not the dragging shuffle of the rotters back in the cities. It was a clicking sound. Sharp. Like bone tapping against tile. I spun around, raising my rifle. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom and landed on a specimen tank that had been shattered from the inside out. Wet footprints led away from it, dark, viscous ichor pooling in the tread marks. I tracked the trail with my light, moving it up the wall. They could climb. The log said muscle density increased. It was clinging to the ceiling pipes, staring down at me. It looked human, but wrong. The skin was a translucent blue-gray, pulled tight over bones that had thickened and spurred. Its fingers were elongated, tipped with black claws that dug into the steel ducts. There were no eyes, just a ridge of calcified bone where the sockets should be. It didn't need to see. It could hear my heartbeat. It dropped. I didn't think, I reacted. I squeezed the trigger, the muzzle flash strobing the room. The bullets sparked off its chest. The calcified skin acted like ceramic plating. It didn't stagger, it lunged. I dove to the right, crashing into a lab bench, sending beakers smashing to the floor. The creature landed where I had been standing, cracking the floor tiles. It was fast, impossibly fast. I scrambled back, kicking away as it swiped. The claws tore through the leg of my hazmat trousers, grazing the skin. Cold fire shot up my leg. I needed to aim for soft tissue. The mouth. It was the only opening. As it roared, a sound like grinding ice, I lined up the shot. I pumped 3 rounds into the open maw. Black blood sprayed, and the creature thrashed, knocking over a heavy microscope table. It shrieked, a high-pitched frequency that made my vision blur, and collapsed, twitching. I didn't wait to check if it was permanently dead. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sting in my leg, and ran. I needed a defensible position. I needed to secure the samples. The evolution wasn't just theoretical. It was staring me in the face. The cold wasn't a sanctuary. The cold was a catalyst. I sprinted down the corridor, looking for the server room. Heavy doors, magnetic locks. I found it at the end of the hall. I swiped the dead scientist's keycard, praying the clearance was high enough. The light turned green. I threw myself inside and slammed the manual override. The bolts thudded home. Safe. For now. The room was filled with the hum of backup servers. I slumped against the door, sliding down until I hit the floor. I checked my leg. The cut was shallow, but exposure was exposure. I ripped open one of the scavenged antibiotic packets, crushing the powder directly into the wound, gritting my teeth against the burn. Then I uncapped a bottle of sterile water and washed the site. I looked around the server room. It wasn't just data storage, it was a command hub. On the central monitor, a blinking map showed the spread of the Borealis strain. Red dots clustered around major cities, but blue lines, migration paths, were moving north. They were coming here. Drawn to the cold. Drawn to the source. I opened my pack and took inventory again. The inhibitor vials glinted in the LED light. If Dr. Volkov's notes were right, this wasn't a cure, but camouflage. It masked the pheromones of the living. It made you invisible to them. But I needed a centrifuge to stabilize it, and the one in the lab was smashed. I stood up, adrenaline fading, replaced by the deep, aching fatigue of the tundra. I began to search the server room racks. Sometimes techies kept stashes. Under a floor panel, I found a survival kit, thermal blankets, a flare gun, and a bottle of high-end vodka. I almost laughed. Russia. I took a swig of the vodka, letting the burn settle my nerves. I had the data. I had the inhibitor samples. But I was trapped 3 levels down in a tomb that was waking up. I checked my ammo. 2 magazines left. I pulled the datapad back out. There was a schematic of the ventilation system. If I could reach the exhaust vents in Sector 2, I could climb out to the surface. Bypassing the main elevators where the things would surely be hunting. But Sector 2 was cold storage. If the subject I just fought was adapted to the cold, what was waiting in the cryovaults? I reloaded my rifle, the spring tension tight. Scavenging is about weighing risks. The risk of staying here was 100% death when the power failed. The risk of the vents was unknown. Unknown was better. I packed the gear tight, silencing zippers with duct tape. I was done looting. Now, I was escaping. I unlocked the door, the heavy steel retracting. The hallway was dark, but I could hear them. Clicking. Dozens of them. They were waking up. The wind out here doesn't just blow, it strips. It peels away layers of hope just as effectively as it hunts for gaps in your thermal gear. I had been tracking the faint signal for 3 days across the Siberian wastes. A white void where the horizon dissolves into a headache-inducing blur of snow and gray sky. The facility, designated OBX-71 on the faded map I'd pulled off a frozen lieutenant in Yakutsk, emerged from the blizzard like the ribcage of some colossal, concrete beast. It wasn't merely abandoned, it was sealed. The blast doors were caked in 10 years of ice, welded shut by the climate itself. I didn't knock. I found a ventilation shaft halfway up the leeward side of the administrative block. Its grate blown outward, the first sign that whatever happened here, it happened from the inside out. Dropping into the facility felt like stepping into a vacuum. The howling gale was instantly replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against my eardrums. My respirator hissed, the only rhythm in the dark. I clicked on my shoulder-mounted lamp, the beam cutting through stale air that smelled of ozone, copper, and something sweeter, like rotting lilies. The reception area was a chaotic freeze frame of the evacuation. Papers littered the floor, frozen stiff. Overturned desks formed jagged barricades. I moved with the practiced fluid motion of a scavenger who knows that noise is death. My boots, wrapped in makeshift fur dampeners, made no sound on the linoleum. Scavenging in a high-security zone requires a different mindset than looting a grocery store. I wasn't looking for canned beans. I was looking for tech and containment gear. I checked the guard station first. 2 bodies. They weren't shamblers. They were skeletons in rotting uniforms, slumped against the wall with Makarov pistols in their laps. 1 bullet each in the skull. Suicide pact. This was early days behavior, before people realized coming back was the worst part. I stripped them of their ammo, 9x18mm, useless for my rifle but good trade fodder, and checked their filters. Degraded. Useless. I pushed deeper, bypassing the elevators. Never trust hydraulics in a dead zone. The stairwell was a spiraling descent into the throat of the facility. On level B3, the atmosphere changed. The temperature actually rose, hovering just above freezing. This meant the geothermal backup was still cycling, bleeding heat into the lower labs. It also meant the biomass wouldn't be frozen solid. My grip tightened on the foregrip of my carbine. Level B3 was research and pathology. The glass walls of the observation decks were smeared with dried black fluid. I vaulted a reception desk, landing softly, and began rifling through the drawers. Pay dirt. A box of syrettes, epinephrine and broad-spectrum antibiotics. I shoved them into my dump pouch. But it was the files on the desk that caught my light. A logbook, heavy and bound in synthetic leather. I flipped it open, the pages stiff. The entries detailed the Epsilon strain, a variant of the infection I hadn't encountered in the cities. The notes described hyperadrenal activity. The subjects didn't just reanimate. They metabolized muscle mass for explosive bursts of energy. They didn't rot in the traditional sense. They calcified. A noise down the hall froze my blood. It wasn't the dragging shuffle of the dead I was used to. It was a click, sharp, rhythmic, like nails tapping on glass. I killed my light. Darkness swallowed the corridor, save for the faint, dying green glow of the emergency exit signs. I listened. The clicking stopped, replaced by a wet, rapid inhalation. It was sniffing the air. I moved by memory, sliding into an open lab bay. I needed to see what I was dealing with. The room was lined with vertical tanks, most shattered, the preservation fluid long since evaporated. But the one in the corner was intact. I risked a flicker of my tack light, shielding the beam with my hand. Inside the tank was a specimen, suspended in cloudy amber liquid. It looked armored. The skin had hardened into a gray, chitinous shell. Bone spurs protruded from the elbows and knees. The jaw was split, unhinged to allow for a wider bite. This wasn't random mutation. This was weaponization. The virus had been guided, coaxed into creating a shock trooper. The clicking returned, louder now. Just outside the door. I realized with a jolt of horror that the sound wasn't nails on glass. It was echolocation. These things had been evolving in the pitch black of this buried tomb for a decade. They didn't need eyes. They hunted by sound and smell. I scanned the room for an exit. A ventilation duct high on the wall. Too high to reach silently. I had to fight. I unslung my carbine, flipping the selector to semi-auto. I pulled a flare from my belt. If they adapted to the dark, light was my weapon. I cracked the flare and tossed it into the corridor. The magnesium hissed, igniting the hallway in blinding red brilliance. The shriek that followed wasn't human. It sounded like tearing metal. The creature scrambled into the doorway, silhouetted by the crimson glare. It was skeletal but broad, its skin resembling the cracked concrete of the bunker. It had no eyes, just smooth, pale skin over the sockets, and a mouth full of needle teeth that chattered incessantly. It recoiled from the light, shielding its face with a clawed hand. I fired. 2 shots to the chest. The round sparked. The calcified skin acted like ceramic plate armor. The creature didn't fall. It lunged. It covered the 20 feet between us in a heartbeat, moving on all fours with terrifying agility. I dropped to a knee, adjusting my aim, and put a round through the soft tissue of its open mouth. The back of its head blew out in a spray of black ichor. It collapsed, sliding to a halt at my boots. I didn't wait to inspect the kill. The flare was still burning, and the shriek had been a dinner bell. I heard them now, dozens of them. A chorus of clicking and clicking rising from the elevator shafts, from the ceiling vents, from the floor grates. The hive had woken up. I scrambled onto a lab table and kicked out the grate of the ventilation shaft I'd dismissed earlier. Adrenaline is a hell of a drug. I hauled myself up just as the first set of gray hands grabbed the table leg, ripping the steel bolts from the floor. I crawled, elbows and knees scraping against the galvanized steel of the duct, dragging my pack behind me. Below, the room filled with the sounds of frenzy, snarling, tearing, the wet thud of bodies colliding. They were eating the corpse of the one I'd killed. Cannibalistic efficiency. They wasted nothing. I pushed deeper into the vents, heading toward the structural blueprints I'd memorized from the entrance. The armory was on B4. If the infection had evolved into armored hunters, my 5.56 rounds were essentially spitballs. I needed armor-piercing rounds, or better yet, high explosives. I crawled for what felt like an hour, the metal cooling rapidly as I moved away from the geothermal core. My breath began to fog again. I reached a grate looking down into a secure storage locker. It was untouched. The heavy maglocks had kept the scavengers and the dead out. I kicked the grate through and dropped, landing in a crouch. The room was pristine. Rows of racks. I bypassed the standard assault rifles. I went to the heavy containment cage in the back. Bolt cutters, heavy, industrial ones I carried for this exact purpose, snapped the padlock. Inside was a prototype Gauss rifle and 3 battery cells. Beside it, crates of depleted uranium flechettes. This was the evolution the humans had planned to counter the infection. They just didn't live long enough to use it. I loaded the weapon, the hum of the capacitor charging feeling like life returning to my numb fingers. I grabbed a jagged piece of mirror from a broken locker and held it under the door gap. The hallway outside was teeming with them. They were clinging to the walls, the ceiling, waiting. They knew I was here. They could smell the sweat, the fear, the blood pumping in my veins. I checked the charge. 100%. I had food for 3 days, water for 2, and a weapon that could punch through a tank. The only way out was back up through the hive. I took a deep breath of the stale, recycled air. The evolution of the infection was terrifying, a marvel of biological adaptation. But they had forgotten one thing: prey adapts too. I kicked the door open. The airlock cycled with a groan that vibrated through the soles of my boots. A mechanical death rattle echoing into the infinite white void of the Siberian waste behind me. As the heavy steel wheel spun and locked, the hissing of depressurization faded, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing inside the gas mask. The readout on my wrist flickered, oxygen levels were stable. But the temperature in the decontamination chamber was dropping rapidly to match the interior. I wasn't just walking into a grave. I was walking into a freezer. This was Object 77B, a black site relic of the Soviet era that had gone dark long before the world fell apart, only to be reactivated in desperation when the infection first crossed the Urals. Rumors intercepted on the dying shortwave bands spoke of a vaccine, or a weapon, or a bunker. I was just hoping for heat. I pushed through the inner blast door, my tactical light cutting a cone through the gloom. The air was stale, tasting of recycled ozone and ancient copper, preserved perfectly by the sub-zero climate. The first thing I noticed wasn't the bodies, but the lack of smell. Usually, these places reek of rot, the sweet, cloying scent of necrotic flesh that clings to your clothes for weeks. Here, everything was sterile, purged by the cold. The hallway stretched out into darkness, the floor tiles cracked and frosted over. I kept my MP5 raised, the suppressor heavy on the barrel, sweeping the corners. My boots crunched on broken glass, discarded vials, shattered overhead lights. To my left, a security checkpoint. The glass was spiderwebbed with bullet impacts, but the skeletons inside sat slumped in their chairs, still wearing their heavy ashankas. I vaulted the counter, looking for anything useful. This was the scavenging phase, the most dangerous part, where greed often outweighed caution. I checked the drawers. A half-empty box of 9 by 18 mm Makarov rounds, useless for my loadout, but good for trade if I ever saw another living soul. A rusted ring of keys. And then the prize, a Geiger counter that rattled to life with a low, steady click, and a military-grade PDA, its battery dead but its casing intact. I pocketed them. Scavenging in the tundra meant prioritizing calories and warmth over firepower, but in a research lab, information was the currency. I moved deeper, descending the stairs to level 2. The temperature dropped further. My breath fogged the faceplate of my mask, forcing me to wipe it every few minutes. The walls here were lined with containment suits, hanging like flayed skins on hooks. I bypassed the locker room and headed for the mess hall. If there was food, it would be there. The double doors were barricaded from the outside, a chair jammed under the handles. Someone had wanted to keep whatever was inside. I kicked the chair away, the wood shattering with a loud crack that echoed like a gunshot. I froze, listening. Silence. Just the hum of the facility's dying geothermal reactor deep below. Inside the mess hall, the scene was a tableau of frozen violence. Dozens of bodies lay scattered, not eaten but torn. It looked like a riot had broken out. I moved to the pantry, stepping over a corpse wearing a lab coat. His face was a mask of blue terror, crystallized frost coating his eyelashes. I ransacked the shelves. Most of the cans had burst from the cold, the contents freeze-dried into useless pucks. But I found 3 tins of beef tushanka that had survived, along with a sealed packet of dried fruit and a box of high-caffeine tea. Gold dust. I shoved them into my pack, feeling the weight settle against my spine. Leaving the mess hall, I found the first sign that the infection here was different. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like industrial marker, were frantic notes. Subject 44 adapting. Thermoregulation failed. Cryogenic dormancy confirmed. Do not use heat. I stared at the words. The standard infected were shambling wrecks, driven by basic motor functions and hunger. They froze solid in winter and thawed out in spring, usually too damaged to move. But this suggested something else. Adaptation? I made my way to the research wing on level 3. The blast doors here were open, ripped from their hydraulic hinges. The metal was bent outward, as if something immense had pushed its way out. I entered a lab labeled Viral Genomics. Papers littered the floor. I grabbed a handful, scanning the Cyrillic text under my flashlight. Strain Delta Frost. Cellular walls thickening. Exothermic reaction to trauma. The scientists here hadn't just been studying the virus. They had been weaponizing it for Arctic warfare. Trying to create soldiers that could operate in the absolute zero of a nuclear winter. They succeeded, and then they died. I needed to find the main server room to download the data from the PDA, maybe find a map of the lower levels where the reactor, and the heat, was. As I turned the corner toward the server corridor, my light swept over a row of what looked like statues. There were 6 of them, standing perfectly still against the walls. They were naked, their skin a translucent, icy blue, stretched tight over bone and muscle that looked hardened, almost like chitin. No rot. No open wounds. They looked like ice sculptures carved in the shape of men. I took a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The floor creaked. Instantly 6 heads snapped toward me. There was no groan, no guttural roar. Just the sound of cracking ice. The eyes of the nearest one opened, solid white, no pupils, glowing faintly in the reflection of my flashlight. It didn't shamble. It sprinted. The movement was jerky but terrifyingly fast, a blur of blue limbs. I raised the MP5 and fired a 3-round burst. The bullets hit the creature's chest, but instead of the wet thud of tearing flesh, there was a sharp clack-clack-clack, like striking ceramic. The rounds ricocheted, sparking off its hardened dermis. The creature didn't even slow down. It slammed into me, driving the wind from my lungs, and we went down hard on the frosted tiles. The cold radiating off it was intense, burning through my gear. Its hands, tipped with jagged, blackened claws, scrabbled at my throat. I jammed the muzzle of my gun under its chin, right into the softer tissue of the neck, and pulled the trigger. The suppressor coughed. Black blood, thick as crude oil, sprayed onto my visor. The creature went limp, its weight crushing me. I shoved it off, gasping, scrambling backward. The other 5 were moving now, closing the distance. They were pack hunters. They didn't stumble. They flowed over the obstacles, their movements silent. Headshots, I muttered to myself, hands shaking as I reloaded. Go for the soft spots. I backed into the lab, overturning a heavy steel table to create a choke point. The first one leaped over it, mouth unhinging to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. I fired 1-2 shots to the eye socket. The skull shattered like a glass bowl, and it dropped. The evolution was terrifying. The virus had repurposed the body's water content, turning it into a natural armor of biological ice. They were brittle, but hard. I switched to semi-auto to conserve ammo. The third one flanked left, crawling along the wall like a spider. I tracked it, breathing steady, and put a round through its ear. It fell. 2 more rushed the table. I grabbed a beaker of some clear liquid from the counter, ethanol maybe, and hurled it, following it up with a road flare from my belt. The flare ignited with a blinding red hiss. When it hit the ethanol-soaked creature, the reaction was catastrophic. The creature didn't just burn, it ruptured. The rapid temperature change caused its frozen, hardened skin to shatter. It exploded in a shower of gore and ice shards, knocking the other one back. The "do not use heat" warning on the wall wasn't about safety. It was about volatility. These things were walking pressure bombs. I scrambled out the back exit of the lab as the remaining creatures screeched, a high-pitched sound like metal grinding on metal. I sprinted down the corridor, checking the compass on my watch. The server room was ahead. I slammed the heavy door shut behind me and spun the locking wheel just as a heavy impact dented the steel from the outside. Safe. For now. The server room was humming, the lights dim. Rows of blue LEDs blinked in the dark. I slumped against the door, sliding down to the floor, wiping the black sludge from my visor. I checked my ammo. 2 mags left. And I was only on level 3. The reactor was on level 5. I plugged the dead PDA into a terminal, praying the voltage was compatible. The screen flickered to life. Files began to scroll. I wasn't just looking for a map anymore. I was looking for the synthesis logs. If they made these things, they had to have a way to unmake them. A solvent, a frequency, something. A video file popped up. A man in a hazmat suit, speaking rapidly in Russian, his eyes wide with lack of sleep. "The frost doesn't kill the virus," the translation software read. "It perfects it. We tried to create a dormant soldier. We created a perennial predator. If you are watching this, do not let the temperature rise above freezing. If they thaw, they metabolize. They become faster." I looked at the thermostat on the wall. The heat from the running servers had bumped the room temperature up to 1 degree Celsius. Outside the door, the banging stopped. Then I heard a sound that chilled my blood more than the Siberian wind ever could. It was the sound of dripping water. The ice on the other side of the door wasn't cracking anymore. It was melting. And from the wet, gurgling growls that followed, I knew the scientist was right. The ones outside weren't trying to break in anymore. They were waking up. I grabbed the PDA, unholstered my sidearm, and looked at the ventilation grate in the floor. It was a tight squeeze, but it led down. Into the dark. Into the hive. I had scavenged food, I had scavenged intel, but now I had to scavenge a way out before the thaw turned this tomb into a slaughterhouse.